So moving into the structure of muscles and how this structure can help guide us in terms of understanding what kind of strategies might we want to use to deliver load to a certain tissue or a certain region. Because as we'll see here, when we move from proximal to distal, the structure of each muscle will look very different. And this is because each muscle will express a different role or a different behavior that help the system share load over broader surface areas. Now, just to emphasize this point again at the top, we need to be able to decelerate forces before we produce them. Okay, or we need to be able to control disturbances acting on our system before we try to overcome them, because the environment is always acting on our system first. Okay, and this is one of the main reasons as to why we have this differentiation from proximal to distal in our muscle structure. But not only muscle structure, the joint organization as well. But we'll get to that later. So let's look at the difference between the glute max and the hamstrings. Okay, so the glute max is a monoarticular muscle tissue, right, with a lot of mass, with parallel muscle fibers, where the muscle fibers extend parallel to the line of pull. Okay, and this makes the glute max very good at allowing for movement over larger excursions. Okay, and this is obviously important when the glute max passes over a joint like the hip that has a huge amount of degrees of freedom. Okay, huge amount of movement potential. But these parallel fibers also allow the glute max to bias more of a force production role, where it's expressing lots of positive work. Right, now, this is important when we think about it from a force production versus force deceleration standpoint, because if we want to share stress over broader surface areas, we don't want to have a lot of muscles distributed throughout our body that look like and behave like the glute max. Like, we don't want muscles throughout the whole lower limb that look like glute maxes all the way down to the foot and the ankle, right? Because that would be a very energy expensive way to move. So as we move distally into the hamstrings, for example, here, the hamstrings are a very complex muscle in that it's not just a simple tendon to muscle to tendon organization. They're all biarticular apart from the short head of the biceps fem, and because of all the connective tissue that runs through this muscle and the longer tendons, the hamstrings will bias more of a pinnate structure, where the muscle fibers extend at an angle in relation to the tendon. And this means that the muscle fibers themselves don't allow for a lot of movement excursion, but it's more so the tendinous tissue that allows for that movement excursion. When we couple this understanding with the fact that the hamstrings are a very long muscle compared to the glute max, and the hamstrings span a very long joint segment like the femur that doesn't have a lot of segmentation like the spine, for example, the hamstrings will bias more isometric behavior to help our system manage stress and manage or control disturbances acting on it, which also allows the tendon to store energy as well. Now, of course, we can consciously allow muscles to take on all kinds of different behaviors, but this kind of thinking, what we're thinking about here is from a perspective of what does this muscle structure tell us about the potential role that those tissues play to help us handle loads and forces. And as practitioners, we can understand if a client in a clinical situation is able to express those behaviors, because what we tend to see clinically a lot is that individuals might lose these capacities to express these behaviors, to share forces, and then you have muscles that are expressing a role that they really shouldn't be expressing over sustained periods. And a nice example of this is when you have a client with lower back pain standing in front of you or even lying on the table within a low intensity task where they shouldn't really be expressing a lot of energy, but they're isometrically contracting their glutes when they're lying on the table, right? So they're expressing a high threshold strategy during a low threshold task, right? So they're using the proximal tissues to try and handle that stress with a certain contractile role of the glutes that they really shouldn't be expressing when in that low intensity situation. Okay, so what we need to do in those situations is have an appreciation of this diversified behavior, this diversified role of muscle structure throughout the lower limb and even into the upper limb as well when we get to that point, because this can help us understand why they're using these strategies and what kind of strategies that we might need to use as therapists to push them in the right direction and restore that robust movement behavior. Okay.